Make yourself comfortable. Let your body settle into the chair or bed you're in. Breathe in slowly. Hold for a moment. Exhale and feel the weight of the day begin to soften. There's no hurry here. There's nothing pressing to accomplish. Tonight, we're simply going to walk through a few quiet rooms. Places where voices were shaped, where small discoveries happened in half-lit booths, and where the people who made our childhoods felt very human. Imagine a studio corridor. The light is warm and low. There's a soft carpet underfoot that muffles footsteps. The doors to the booths are heavy, soundproofed, with little windows that glow like small safe lamps. Inside each booth, a microphone stands like a tiny tree. Headphones hang ready, scripts lie folded, coffee cups cool. It's a place of concentration, of small rituals. Clearing your throat, tapping the page twice, taking a breath, and then speaking as if the words have always lived in you. The work we'll listen to tonight is quiet in its origin but expansive in its reach. A single tone, a small laugh, a carefully timed sigh. Those tiny choices ripple outward once animation and music and editing do their careful work. A child in a suburban living room laughs in a certain way, and suddenly a generation has a memory. A villain's chuckle, shaped in a booth on a rainy afternoon, becomes the sound you think of when you imagine danger in a cartoon world. We're not here for trivia. We're not rattling off facts quickly to see how many views a list might pull. Instead, we're slowing down to notice craftsmanship, the patient attention that lives in the margins of performance. The differences are small. A pause that breathes emotion into a single line, the decision to let a vowel hang longer, the choice to make a whisper sound like confession. Those choices are what make characters feel like friends, enemies, neighbors, or family. So tonight we start with child voices. There is a strange tenderness in working with kids as performers. Their honesty is a rare and delicate resource. Children don't usually mask. They offer a directness that can be startling in its truth. But children are also changing creatures. They iron out, blossom, and then drift toward new registers as time moves on. If you close your eyes for a moment, picture a casting director's desk. Papers and audition tapes piled gently. A cup of tea gone cold. For shows like Hey Arnold, someone like Joey Paul Jensen would sit there for hours, listening to one audition after another. Hundreds of little voices, each with its own rhythm and flavor. Joey would need ears that spotted not only what a child could do today but what the voice might do 2 seasons from now. Listening for longevity is different from listening for momentary charm. Lane Torrens' story fits into that gentle patience. When Lane read for Arnold, it wasn't a constructed voice he brought. He simply spoke, and what he spoke sounded like the kind of kid you might meet on a stoop. Observant, kind, slightly old-fashioned in his decency. That authenticity became Arnold. But then life did what it always does. Lane grew. Puberty changed the instruments of his voice. And instead of erasing that change, the show found a way to carry Lane forward. He moved into another role, Wolfgang, where his deeper timbre fit. They wrote transition into the world, and by doing so, they respected both the character and the person who had first given it shape. There is something humane about that approach. It recognizes that stories, and the people who help tell them, are living. They change. We can either pretend they don't, or we can make the change part of the tale. Hey Arnold chose the latter, and that choice is almost like a small act of kindness toward the audience and the actor. Sometimes voices change in a way that only enriches a character. Jameel Walker Smith's Gerald, for example, deepened as his voice matured, and the creative team decided that the new tone suited Gerald's role as a cool, quietly confident friend. Later, when Spencer Klein stepped in, he studied those rhythms and added his own flourishes, little rhythmic improvisations that felt jazz-like, turning dialogue into a casual performance with a musicality all its own. Improvisation is a theme you'll come back to often in these stories. When actors are allowed to play in the booth, to add a small breath here, a dismissive chuckle there, sometimes the best moments appear unplanned. Olivia Hack's Rhonda, that posh, style-conscious classmate, benefited from such spontaneity. In sessions with multiple child actors, the energy shifts. Kids start to riff. Olivia added tiny, perfectly timed sighs and offhand comments that the writers kept. Those found moments can make a scripted scene feel lived in. And then there's the kind of wild energy a role like Curly requires. Justin Shenkarow played Curly with a kind of gleeful unpredictability. You can almost imagine him taking a line and deciding, in the moment, that Curly is now going to shriek or growl or backflip emotionally across a sentence. That level of risk, letting an improvised idea run with the scene, is what makes the character unforgettable. It's the difference between an actor performing and an actor inventing. Walk with me, if you will, into another studio, lined with small toys and warm lighting, where a team recorded a show about babies. Rugrats required a particularly imaginative approach. The premise, viewing the world from a toddler's perspective, sounds simple until you imagine the technical challenge. How to make adult viewers believe that infants have inner lives, opinions, fears, and courage. That credibility depends heavily on vocal texture. E.G. Daly, who voiced Tommy Pickles, has a story that reads almost like a parable of dedication. There was a session when she finished lines and then went into labor. She completed the recording and then went to the hospital. The image of someone voicing a toddler's curiosity and bravery, then bringing a child into the world, is quietly poetic. It reminds us how entwined art and life often are. The tenderness in her performance is partly that lived experience, perhaps an extra softness in a line, a pause that carries a touch more affection. Tommy's friendship with Chucky, voiced by Christine Cavanaugh, is built on deep listening. E.G. and Christine didn't merely read from the same page. They created a rhythm of trust. When Tommy encourages, you can hear the sincere warmth in E.G.'s phrasing. When Chucky expresses doubt, Christine's pauses and careful inflections make his anxiety sound thoughtful, not merely cartoonish. That interplay, born of real listening in the booth, becomes a model of how voice acting can mimic real human relationships. Kath Soucie's work as Phil and Lil is another kind of skill altogether. She had to create two distinct but connected minds. Voicing twins means reacting to yourself, shifting mid-conversation, and maintaining two personalities that are intertwined, sometimes finishing each other's thoughts. The small noises, a murmur, a burp of delight, a shared giggle, are what makes them feel like real children inhabiting the same space. And then there's Joe Alaskey, who could layer a Grandpa Lou with improvisational monologues that felt lived in and generational. His voice carried a particular cadence of memory, those long, gentle sentences of someone who has watched a family grow. In the midst of the baby's chaotic adventures, Grandpa Lou's ramblings anchored the show in a kind of affectionate history. We begin to see a through line. It isn't that actors simply read lines well. It's that they bring fragments of life into the booth. They borrow from their own rhythms, from the cadence of a grandmother humming while folding laundry, to the rapid bursts of a child's excited speech. Those borrowings become part of the character. They make scenes breathe. If you breathe in with me now, hold it a fraction longer, and let the exhale be a soft wash. Notice how your body can reflect the pacing I'm describing. When we slow story, time stretches. The same is true in narration. Detail and gentle repetition lengthen experience without wearing it thin. The next room we'll wander into is less about age and more about technique. Dexter's Laboratory, a hilariously precise show that required actors to think like musicians and engineers. Dexter, with his clipped, almost exaggerated accent, needed purposeful diction. Christine Cavanaugh crafted that speech with studied attention, borrowing the rhythm of Eastern European speech patterns without imitating any single nationality. It made Dexter sound set apart, precise, slightly archaic, a child who had structured his language like an experiment. Dee Dee required a different kind of work. Her voice needed the physicality of movement. It had to feel as if she were actually dancing across the room. So Cat Cressida would stand, hop, spin, moving so the breath and momentum registered in her voice. The result was not only believable, it was contagious on the track. When Dee Dee laughed and crashed through the scene, you could feel the motion in the vocal performance. This physical connection between body and sound is a thread you'll notice again and again. Great voice actors don't merely speak, they inhabit. They move so their breath patterns, posture, and energy inform the voice. That's why the smallest of actions, leaning forward to whisper, taking a step back in surprise, change timbre in a meaningful way. Tonight's stories will be full of these small movements. They're the substance of longer listening. We'll keep circling back to the same characters, each time noticing a different facet. An improvisation that stuck, a breath that carried grief, a pause that revealed tenderness. That repetition isn't empty. It's deliberate. Think of it like shading in a painting. You don't outline once and stop. You return to the same line with different pressure, different color, and finally depth emerges. Before we move on, take another slow breath. Feel how much you can hear in a pause when someone speaks softly into a microphone. Those pauses are not empty. They are the spaces where truth settles. They are the small rooms where actors place meaning. When you are ready, we will continue, moving deeper into individual performances, returning to the specific shows you love, and rehearsing these facts slowly until they feel familiar and full. We'll spend more time with Helga's secret poetry, with Angelica's theatrical tantrums, with Tom Kenny's improvisational generosity, and with Kevin Conroy's quiet duality. Each detail will be revisited in a way that respects both the fact itself and the larger sensation it creates. Comfort, memory, and the gentle ache of nostalgia. For now, rest in this small light. Let the idea of a warm studio booth settle like a friendly memory behind your eyes. As the glow of childhood cartoons settles around us, it's easy to forget just how invisible the people behind those voices often are. We remember the characters instantly. We remember how they sounded, how they made us feel, how familiar they became. But the humans behind them, they usually stayed hidden, quietly shaping entire generations of memories from inside small recording booths. And maybe that's part of the magic. Voice acting, especially in the golden era of 90s animation, wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about being recognized on the street. It was about disappearing completely into someone else, becoming a voice that felt like it had always existed. One of the best places to begin understanding that craft is with Dexter's Laboratory, a show built almost entirely on contrast, order and chaos, precision and destruction, silence and noise, a genius child speaking with absolute confidence, and a sister who shattered that confidence just by entering the room. Dexter's voice was not accidental. Christine Cavanaugh didn't simply do a funny accent. She constructed Dexter carefully, piece by piece. She studied European accents, listened to scientists and intellectuals, and blended those influences into something that felt both exaggerated and believable. Dexter sounded like a child who had learned his speech patterns from books, not playgrounds. That's why his voice carried such weight. Every syllable was deliberate. Every word felt measured. Even when Dexter was panicking, there was still an attempt at control, as if losing composure was the ultimate failure. Christine recorded Dexter with an almost physical tension. Her posture would tighten. Her delivery would sharpen. She didn't just say the lines. She held them. That tension translated into sound. You could hear Dexter's rigid worldview in the way he spoke. And then there was Dee Dee. Where Dexter was all compression and restraint, Dee Dee was expansion. movement, noise, uncontainable energy. When Kat Cressida stepped into the role, she didn't try to tone that down. She leaned into it completely. Dee Dee wasn't just loud. She was physical. Kat didn't stand still in the booth. She moved. She spun. She bounced. She let her arms swing, her body tilt, her breath shorten and stretch. Dee Dee's chaos was real because it came from a body in motion. And that physicality mattered. Because voice doesn't exist in isolation. Carries posture, breath, movement. When Dee Dee crashed through Dexter's lab, you could hear the motion before you ever saw it animated. What made their dynamic last for so many episodes wasn't repetition, it was variation. Christine and Kat understood that sibling chaos can't be static. Sometimes Dexter exploded immediately. Sometimes he tried to reason first. Sometimes Dee Dee was curious. Sometimes she was oblivious. Sometimes she was secretly trying to connect. Those small shifts kept the conflict alive. Familiar but never stale. And that idea that characters must evolve emotionally even if their roles stay the same, runs through nearly every great voice performance of that era. Take Rugrats, for example. On the surface, it's a show about babies. But the performances never treated the characters as simple or silly. The babies had fears, motivations, moral codes, and the actors approached them with seriousness, not heaviness, but sincerity. Christine Cavanaugh returned here too, this time as Chucky Finster. Chucky's fear was not comedic noise. It was specific, rational. He worried about real things. Getting hurt, losing loved ones, being left behind. Christine voiced Chucky with vulnerability that never crossed into caricature. His voice shook not because he was weak, but because he cared. And that distinction made him relatable. Opposite him was Tommy Pickles, voiced by E.G. Daly. Tommy was not fearless, he was curious. His bravery came from belief, from trust. And E.G. understood that Tommy didn't lead by overpowering Chucky. He led by believing in him. Their scenes together felt intimate because the actors listened. When Chucky hesitated, Tommy slowed down. When Tommy pressed forward, Chucky followed. Not because he wanted danger, but because he trusted his friend. That rhythm wasn't accidental. It was built over time, session after session, through subtle adjustments. Pause here, a softer tone there, a reassurance that lingered just a moment longer. Then there were Phil and Lil, both voiced by Kath Soucie. Twins who didn't just speak. They interrupted, echoed, finished each other's thoughts. Kath didn't rely only on dialogue. She added sounds, small noises, shared laughs, confident grunts. She created the illusion of two minds constantly in sync, not through volume, but through timing. That's an advanced skill, performing a relationship with yourself and making it sound organic. And hovering above them all was Angelica. Cree Summer didn't scream randomly. She sculpted Angelica's tantrums. Each one had shape, a beginning, a build, climax, and often, an abrupt stop the moment power was restored. Angelica's voice carried entitlement, but also intelligence. She wasn't cruel because she didn't understand others. She was cruel because she did. Cree played that awareness beautifully. Angelica knew exactly how to manipulate adults and terrify babies. And she enjoyed it. But even Angelica had quiet moments. Moments of insecurity. Moments when the voice softened just enough to hint at loneliness. Those moments mattered because they reminded us she was still a child, just one with too much control. Across all these performances, there's a shared truth emerging. Great voice acting isn't about exaggeration alone. It's about listening, about responding, about understanding why a character speaks the way they do, not just how. That truth becomes even clearer when we step into a world like Hey Arnold. A city that breathed. a neighborhood that felt lived in, a show that trusted silence as much as dialogue. Arnold himself was voiced with gentleness. Lane Torren didn't push emotion, he let it exist naturally. Arnold sounded like someone who listened more than he spoke, someone thoughtful, someone grounded. And when Lane's voice began to change, the show didn't hide it. They acknowledged it with compassion. A throat surgery episode, a narrative bridge, a quiet recognition that children grow, and that growth doesn't need to be disguised. That kind of respect extended to Helga. Francesca Marie Smith didn't just insult Arnold. She varied those insults. Because Helga's cruelty was layered. Sometimes defensive, sometimes performative, sometimes aching with affection. Football head didn't mean one thing. It meant many things. And Francesca delivered it differently every time, depending on who was listening and what Helga was hiding. Behind all of this was a deeper philosophy shared by the best creators of the era. That children deserve emotional honesty. That characters deserve interior lives. And that voices, when treated with care, can carry all of that quietly, gently, without spectacle. As we continue, you'll notice this pattern repeating. Across studios, across shows, across styles. Actors listening, creators trusting them, characters becoming more than drawings. Let that settle for now. Let the sounds soften. Let the world slow. We'll continue soon. With a city full of superheroes, villains, and donut-loving mayors, and the voices that made them unforgettable. As we drift onward, we arrive in a place that feels louder on the surface, yet strangely gentle beneath it all. A city built on chaos and color. A place constantly under threat, yet always safe by the end of the day. Townsville. At first glance, the Powerpuff Girls feels like pure energy. Bright colors, fast action, villains bursting through buildings. A non-stop rhythm that rarely pauses. But beneath that kinetic exterior was something surprisingly careful. Something deeply intentional. Because for all its explosions and absurdity, the Powerpuff Girls was a show about tone. About balance. About how quickly the world can shift from silly to scary, from playful to unsettling, and then back again. And nowhere was that balance more evident than in its voice acting. Townsville wasn't populated by background noise. It was populated by personalities. And many of those personalities came from one voice, quietly reshaping itself again and again. Tom Kenny. Before SpongeBob SquarePants became a cultural landmark, Tom was already everywhere. Not in a flashy way, not as a star, but as a craftsman. Someone who could disappear into a show and quietly hold it together from the inside. In the Powerpuff Girls, Tom didn't just play a character. He played the infrastructure of Townsville. The mayor, of course, was the most visible. That panicked, donut-obsessed figure who seemed permanently overwhelmed by the responsibility of leadership. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't competent. But he was sincere. And that sincerity mattered. The mayor didn't sound authoritative. He sounded anxious. His voice trembled. His words tumbled over each other. And that wasn't an accident. Tom didn't approach the mayor as a joke. He approached him as a man who desperately wanted to do the right thing, and had absolutely no idea how. Many of the mayor's most iconic traits weren't scripted. They emerged accidentally. A mumbled line, panicked aside, a flub about donuts that slipped out when Tom lost his place. Instead of stopping the take, the directors listened. And they laughed. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. Those accidental moments became the foundation of the character. The mayor's rambling, his fixation on food, his scattered energy. All of it grew organically, shaped by trust between performer and creator. That trust matters more than most people realize. When an actor feels safe enough to experiment, to fail, something special happens. Characters stop feeling manufactured. They start feeling discovered. But Tom's range went far beyond comedy. In the same show where he voiced one of the most ridiculous authority figures in animation, he also voiced one of its most disturbing villains. Him. Him wasn't loud. Him didn't shout. Him didn't charge into battle swinging fists. Him whispered, and that whisper was terrifying. Tom lowered his volume, smoothed his delivery, let words stretch unnaturally. He spoke softly, forcing the audience to lean in. And in doing so, he created discomfort. Him's menace wasn't physical. It was psychological. And Tom understood that restraint was the key. Where the mayor was frantic, Him was calm. Where other villains were aggressive, Him was patient. He didn't rush. He savored moments. He lingered. That contrast was deliberate. The show needed a villain who felt wrong in a different way. And Tom delivered that unease without raising his voice once. Then there was Snake. Snake hissed, literally and figuratively. Tom stretched consonants, gave the character a slithering rhythm. Words seemed to slide out instead of landing cleanly. But Snake wasn't just menacing. He was arrogant, confident, slightly theatrical. He thought he was cooler than he was. And that self-image made him funny. Tom wasn't just switching voices, he was switching mindsets. Mayor, anxious, scattered, overwhelmed. Snake, smooth, self-assured, performative. Him, quiet, manipulative, chilling. 3 completely different energies. Sometimes in the same episode. Sometimes in the same recording session. That requires more than vocal control. It requires emotional agility. The ability to step fully into one psychological space, then abandon it completely, then enter another. And Tom did it without letting the seams show. But Townsville wasn't built by one voice alone. Tara Strong brought its heart. Bubbles wasn't just the cute one. She was the emotional center of the trio. The character who felt things deeply, who cried easily, who loved fiercely. Tara gave Bubbles softness without fragility. Her voice was high, but not weak. Gentle, but not passive. And then Tara turned around and voiced Princess Morbucks. Princess was sharp, demanding, cruel, entitled. The shift was dramatic and intentional. In scenes where Bubbles and Princess interacted, Tara had to embody both sides of cruelty and vulnerability. She had to feel Bubbles hurt, then immediately deliver Princess's mockery. That's emotionally complex work, because Tara couldn't caricature either role. Bubbles needed sincerity. Princess needed believability, and Tara gave both. What made those scenes work wasn't just technical skill, it was empathy. Tara understood what it felt like to be sensitive, and what it felt like to weaponize confidence. And when Tara recorded with Kathy Cavadini and E.G. Daly, something else emerged. Chemistry. Not scripted chemistry. Lived-in chemistry. During group sessions, Tara added small reactions. Soft sobs. Tiny giggles. Breath catches. Emotional noises that weren't in the script, but belonged in the moment. Those sounds filled the spaces between dialogue. Made the girls feel like sisters rather than co-stars. Because sisters don't just talk. They react. They interrupt. They respond instinctively. That's what audiences felt, even if they couldn't articulate it. Townsville worked because it felt alive. Not because it was loud, but because it was responsive. Actors listened, reacted, adjusted, and that collaborative energy created a city that could shift tone instantly, from slapstick to horror to warmth, without ever breaking immersion. As the lights of Townsville dim and the chaos softens, you can almost hear those voices still moving through the streets, panicking, whispering, laughing, caring. all part of the same world. And as we move forward, we'll step into a very different city, one built on stoops and sidewalks and quiet moments between kids, where voice acting didn't shout to be heard. It simply existed and trusted you to listen. Let that calm settle for now. Leaving the bright chaos of Townsville behind, the world grows quieter. The colors soften, the action slows, and suddenly we find ourselves on a city block that feels familiar. Not spectacular, not heroic, just lived in. This is the world of Hey Arnold, a show that trusted stillness, a show that understood that childhood isn't only loud adventures and big emotions, but also long walks home, unsaid feelings, and moments where nothing happens. Yet everything feels important. The voice acting here wasn't designed to grab attention. It was designed to blend into the world. Arnold didn't sound like a cartoon character. He sounded like a kid you might have known. Calm, thoughtful, slightly removed. Someone who watched more than he spoke. Lane Torren approached Arnold with restraint, and that restraint was the point. Arnold wasn't passive. He was observant. He listened, and Lane made sure his voice reflected that inward focus. Arnold's sentences were measured. His tone rarely spiked. Even in moments of urgency, there was a steadiness beneath the words. That steadiness made him a grounding presence in a world full of louder personalities. But what made Lane's performance truly special was what he didn't do. He didn't push emotion. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't rush. Silence mattered in Hey Arnold, and Lane respected those pauses. He let moments breathe. He allowed thoughts to linger before being spoken. That approach gave the show its unique rhythm, one that felt closer to real life than to traditional animation. Then there was Helga. Helga's voice was sharp where Arnold's was soft, loud where he was quiet, aggressive where he was gentle. But that contrast wasn't just for comedy, it was emotional storytelling. Francesca Marie Smith didn't treat Helga as a bully. She treated her as a child wearing armor. Every insult had weight. Every shout carried tension. Helga didn't lash out because she was cruel. She lashed out because she was overwhelmed. And Francesca understood that Helga's voice needed to shift constantly. When Helga performed for others, her voice was sharp and mocking. When she was alone, reciting poetry, whispering confessions, it softened, became vulnerable, almost fragile. That duality was exhausting to perform, and Francesca carried it with precision. The famous football head insult was never delivered the same way twice. Sometimes it was playful, sometimes bitter, sometimes defensive, sometimes masking longing. Because words don't have fixed meanings, emotions do. And Francesca made sure Helga's emotions always came through. Then there was Grandpa Phil, Dan Castellaneta, best known as the voice of Homer Simpson, transformed himself completely. Grandpa Phil was loud, opinionated, stuck in the past. A man who took up space, who filled silence with stories. Dan didn't rely on comedic timing alone. He layered Grandpa Phil with warmth, with stubborn affection, with generational distance. Phil's voice carried history, regret, pride, nostalgia. He wasn't just comic relief, he was memory. A living reminder that time moves forward whether you want it to or not. And Dan played that with tenderness beneath the bluster. Around them, the city breathed through dozens of voices. Maurice LaMarche shifted effortlessly between authority figures and oddballs. Vincent Schiavelli's presence brought weight and melancholy. Each background character felt like someone with a life beyond the frame. No one sounded like filler, and that was intentional. Hey Arnold treated even its smallest characters as human. Not exaggerated caricatures, not punchlines, just people passing through Arnold's world. That realism required restraint from everyone involved. No one pushed, No one rushed. No one overplayed. The recording sessions reflected that philosophy. Actors were encouraged to underplay, to trust quiet moments, to let the script guide them rather than dominate it. And that trust paid off. Because years later, people don't remember Hey Arnold as a loud show. They remember how it made them feel. Calm, seen, understood. They remember stoops and boarding houses, long walks, soft music, and voices that felt like companions rather than performers. That's not easy to achieve. It requires confidence from creators and actors alike to believe that subtlety can hold attention. And Hey Arnold proved that it could. As we prepare to move on, let the city fade gently. Let the echoes of footsteps and quiet conversations dissolve into the night. Because next, we're heading somewhere very different. A world of shadows, of moral ambiguity, of heroes who whispered instead of shouted. A place where voice acting didn't comfort you, challenged you. As we move away from the quiet sidewalks of Arnold's city, the world doesn't grow louder. It grows darker. Not in a frightening way at first, but in a thoughtful one. The colors deepen. The music slows. The spaces between words stretch longer. And suddenly, animation stops feeling like something meant only for children. This is where Batman, the animated series, lives. A show that didn't rush. A show that didn't explain everything. A show that trusted atmosphere more than action. And at the center of it all was a voice that changed how animated heroes would sound forever. Kevin Conroy. Before Kevin Conroy, superheroes often sounded theatrical. Loud, confident, performative. They announced themselves. They projected strength through volume. Kevin did the opposite. He lowered his voice. He slowed it down. And in doing so, he created something new. Bruce Wayne and Batman were not voiced the same, and that choice was revolutionary. Bruce Wayne spoke openly, casually, almost lightly. His voice carried warmth and ease, even humor at times. He sounded like someone comfortable being seen. Batman, on the other hand, barely spoke at all. When he did, his voice was restrained, controlled, almost detached. Kevin didn't growl, not at first. He compressed. He spoke from the chest, not the throat. Every word felt intentional, weighed, considered. Batman didn't waste sound. That distinction wasn't a studio mandate. It was Kevin's idea. He realized early on that Batman wasn't a louder version of Bruce Wayne. He was a quieter one. Someone who had learned that silence could be more powerful than force. And that philosophy shaped the entire show. Scenes in Batman TS often unfold slowly. Conversations pause. Characters reflect. There are moments where no one speaks at all. Just footsteps, rain, distant city noise. Kevin respected those moments. He didn't fill silence unnecessarily. He let stillness do the work. And when Batman did speak, it mattered. Opposite him was Mark Hamill. The Joker. Where Batman was restraint, Joker was release. Mark didn't play the Joker as chaos alone. He played him as joy. Twisted joy. Dangerous joy. A laugh that wasn't random but deliberate. Mark's laughter wasn't just noise. It had structure. Rise and fall. Breath control. Rhythm. Sometimes it burst out suddenly. Sometimes it crept in slowly, curling around a sentence. The Joker's laugh told you what kind of scene you were in before anything happened. And Mark adjusted constantly. In comedic moments, the laugh was exaggerated, almost playful. In darker moments, it became hollow, thin, uncomfortable. Sometimes it stopped abruptly, replaced by calm, controlled speech that was far more unsettling. That contrast made the Joker unpredictable. And unpredictability is fear. What made Kevin and Mark's performances so powerful wasn't volume. It was contrast. They were opposites in every way. Stillness and chaos, silence and sound, control and indulgence. And because both actors trusted restraint, the show never needed to shout. Then there was Harley Quinn. Arlene Sorkin didn't originally audition for the role was written for her. The creators had seen Arlene perform live and realized there was something unique in her voice. Something playful, sincere, and emotionally open. Harley wasn't just comic relief. She was heartbreak wrapped in humor. Arlene gave Harley warmth, vulnerability, genuine affection. Even when Harley was doing something dangerous or destructive, her voice carried hope, the belief that love might still save her. That sincerity made Harley real. And once again, contrast did the work. Harley's bright, expressive voice clashed beautifully with Batman's restraint and Joker's chaos. She humanized scenes that could have been purely dark. Batman, TAS succeeded because it treated voice acting like acting, not like sound effects. Actors were encouraged to perform emotionally first. Volume came second. Recording sessions were quiet, focused, respectful. Actors sat with scripts, discussing motivation rather than jokes. Directors asked about intention, about what a character felt rather than how they should sound. That environment allowed performances to deepen. Villains weren't one note. Heroes weren't invincible. Everyone carried emotional weight. And audiences felt that weight, even if they didn't consciously notice it at the time. Years later, many people describe Batman, TAS, as their first exposure to moral complexity, to sadness, to empathy for villains, to heroes who carried pain quietly. And that experience didn't come from visuals alone. It came from voices that trusted the listener, that spoke softly enough to invite attention. As the rain continues to fall over Gotham, let the echoes fade slowly. Let the city breathe. Let the quiet linger just a bit longer. Because next, we'll step into a very different space again. A schoolyard, a playground, a world where childhood politics mattered deeply, and voices had to balance humor with realism. After the shadows of Gotham, the world slowly brightens again. Not into something loud or flashy, but into something familiar. A schoolyard, chain-link fences catching the sunlight, cracked asphalt painted with faded hopscotch lines, the echo of a bell in the distance, a place where adults are present, but not really watching. This is the world of Recess, and what made Recess special wasn't its setting. It was how seriously it treated that setting. The playground wasn't just a backdrop. It was a society, a system, a place with rules, hierarchies, alliances, reputations, and consequences. And the voice acting had to carry all of that weight. Because Recess didn't rely on fantasy. No superpowers. No monsters. No exaggerated cartoon physics. It relied on recognition. You weren't supposed to admire these characters. You were supposed to recognize them. T.J. Detweiler, voiced by Andrew Lawrence, didn't sound heroic. He sounded confident but not invincible. His leadership wasn't loud. It was persuasive, friendly, earned. Andrew played T.J. with a natural rhythm, like someone thinking out loud rather than delivering lines. His voice moved easily between humor and sincerity. When TJ joked, it felt casual. When he stood up for someone, it felt instinctive, not rehearsed. That mattered, because real leaders don't announce themselves. They emerge. Spinelli, voiced by Pamela Adlon, was fire and restraint combined. Pamela didn't shout constantly. She controlled her aggression. Spinelli's toughness came from focus, not volume. When Spinelli was angry, her voice sharpened, tightened. When she softened, it wasn't dramatic. It was hesitant, careful, as if vulnerability itself was unfamiliar terrain. Pamela understood something crucial. Tough kids don't fear danger. They fear exposure. And she played that fear subtly. Gretchen, voiced by Ashley Johnson, brought intelligence without arrogance. Her voice wasn't superior, it was thoughtful, curious, slightly awkward. Ashley leaned into Gretchen's social uncertainty, letting pauses linger just a bit longer than expected. Those pauses made Gretchen human. She wasn't a brainy stereotype. She was a kid navigating a world that didn't always value her strengths. Then there was Vince. Cortland Meade voiced Vince with grounded calm. Vince didn't need to prove himself. His voice carried quiet confidence. He spoke like someone comfortable in his own abilities, but not obsessed with them. That balance made Vince aspirational without being unrealistic. And Mikey? Jason Davis gave Mikey warmth. Pure warmth. His voice was open, gentle, earnest. Mikey didn't perform kindness, he was kind. Jason let that sincerity remain unguarded, even when the character was teased. That openness took courage, because sincerity, especially in animation, is risky, can feel exposed. Jason leaned into that vulnerability, and Mikey became the emotional heart of the show. Then there were the adults. Miss Finster, voiced by April Winchell, wasn't a villain. She was authority, structure, fear through inevitability rather than cruelty. April didn't scream constantly. She projected presence. Her voice carried certainty. When Miss Finster spoke, the playground listened. Not because she was loud, but because she was unavoidable. That distinction matters. Recess worked because the voice actors didn't exaggerate childhood. They respected it. They understood that, to a child, playground politics feel as important as adult ones. Friendships feel permanent. Betrayals feel catastrophic. Small victories feel monumental. And the actors honored that emotional scale. Recording sessions for Recess were built around ensemble work. Actors listened to each other, reacted naturally. Directors encouraged conversational pacing instead of punchline delivery. Lines overlapped occasionally. Reactions weren't always perfectly clean. And that imperfection made the world feel alive. Because real conversations aren't polished. They're messy. They interrupt. They breathe. Recess trusted that messiness. It trusted that children watching would recognize themselves in it. Not as caricatures, but as people. And years later, adults still do. They remember the playground as a place of freedom and fear, of belonging and exclusion, of moments that felt small at the time and enormous in memory. Those memories didn't come from visuals alone. They came from voices that felt lived in. Voices that sounded like kids trying to figure things out. As the bell rings and the playground empties, let those sounds fade slowly. Sneakers on pavement, distant laughter, a last argument unresolved. Because next we'll step back and look at something larger. Not just individual performances, but patterns. Actors who appeared again and again across these shows. Voices you didn't notice because they blended too well. And how an entire era of animation was quietly shaped by a small group of people, standing behind microphones, changing childhood one line at a time. As the playground fades behind us, something curious begins to happen. The scenes start to blur together, not because they're confusing, but because the voices feel familiar in a way that's hard to place. You move from Hey Arnold to Rugrats, from Dexter's Laboratory to the Powerpuff Girls, from Recess to Batman, the animated series. Different worlds, different art styles, different tones. And yet, something feels connected. That's because it is. Behind all these shows, quietly shaping an entire era of animation, was a relatively small group of voice actors. An ensemble so versatile, so adaptable, that they disappeared into role after role without drawing attention to themselves. They weren't celebrities to kids watching after school. They weren't marketed. They weren't household names. They were voices you felt before you recognized. Take Pamela Adlon. We've already met her as Spinelli, tough, guarded, fiercely loyal. But Pamela didn't just play Spinelli. She lived across animation in dozens of forms. In Recess, she was controlled aggression. In King of the Hill, she became Bobby, awkward, earnest, emotionally open. In other shows, she softened, or sharpened, or receded entirely. What made Pamela remarkable wasn't range alone. It was restraint. She knew exactly how much personality to reveal. When she auditioned for Recess, she reportedly brought multiple interpretations of Spinelli, not wildly different voices but different emotional weights. One tougher, one quieter, one more defensive, one more explosive. The final Spinelli was a blend. And that blend became iconic precisely because it didn't announce itself. Pamela understood something fundamental. The strongest performances often feel effortless. And she wasn't alone. Tara Strong appeared everywhere during this era, sometimes multiple times in the same show. But what made Tara unique wasn't just her ability to switch voices. It was her emotional agility. She didn't treat characters as types. Bubbles wasn't just sweet. Princess Morbucks wasn't just spoiled. They had internal logic. Tara would often slightly adjust pacing depending on who else was in the scene. If Tom Kenny leaned into chaos, she softened. If he restrained, she escalated. That responsiveness is invisible to viewers, but essential to cohesion. Then there's Kath Soucie. Kath voiced Phil and Lil. She voiced adults. She voiced background characters you never noticed because you weren't meant to. Her gift was naturalism. Kath didn't sound like she was acting. She sounded like she existed. She understood the texture of everyday speech. The unfinished thoughts, the accidental overlaps, the tiny vocal hesitations that make someone feel real. In ensemble casts, actors like Kath often become the glue. They stabilize scenes. They ground heightened performances. They make exaggerated characters believable by contrast. That's why casting directors kept calling her back. And then there's Christine Cavanaugh. Christine's voice defined an entire emotional register of animation in the 90s, thoughtful, slightly strained, vulnerable but determined. Dexter wasn't just funny, he was earnest. Chucky wasn't just scared, he was deeply, achingly sincere. Christine brought vulnerability without fragility. She made characters who were anxious, intelligent, or socially uncertain feel dignified, worth listening to. Her performances invited empathy instead of mockery. That mattered, especially for kids who saw themselves reflected in those anxieties. And perhaps no one exemplified the idea of dual identity more than Kevin Conroy. Kevin's Batman wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was controlled. But what truly set him apart was how deliberately he separated Bruce Wayne from Batman. Two voices, two postures, two philosophies. Bruce Wayne's voice was lighter, social, performative. Batman's voice was lower, still, deliberate, almost meditative. Kevin didn't stumble into that distinction. He designed it. He understood that Batman wasn't just a man in a suit, he was a choice. A persona Bruce entered intentionally. That psychological depth elevated the entire show. And opposite him, Mark Hamill. Mark treated the Joker like jazz. Unpredictable rhythms, sudden shifts, playfulness layered over menace. Mark didn't aim to scare, he aimed to unsettle. To make you laugh and then immediately regret laughing. The Joker's voice danced. It didn't march. That contrast between Batman's stillness and Joker's volatility created tension without shouting. Again, invisible craftsmanship. And that's the theme here. These actors weren't trying to dominate scenes. They weren't competing for attention. They were listening. Animation at this level is ensemble work. Every performance exists in relation to others. A quieter voice makes a louder one feel louder. A grounded delivery makes exaggeration pop. A pause can matter more than a punchline. That's why these shows aged so well. They weren't built on trends. They were built on relationships. Between characters. Between actors. Between voices. As a viewer, you absorbed all of this subconsciously. You didn't know why certain scenes felt comforting. Why certain characters felt trustworthy. Why certain shows felt safe to return to years later. It was because the voices treated you with respect. They didn't rush you. They didn't shout constantly. They trusted you to feel the emotion without being told what to feel. That trust is rare. And it's why these performances linger. So now, as we slow the pace again, let those voices drift together. Not as individual characters, but as a chorus. Different tones, different rhythms, different energies, all part of the same unseen ensemble. In the next part, we'll move even deeper into the recording booth itself, into the quiet, strange, almost meditative space where all of this came together, where actors stood alone imagining worlds, and where small, personal choices quietly became shared memories for millions. Before there were episodes, before animation cells, before theme songs and network schedules, there was a room, small, quiet, often windowless, a recording booth. This is where everything we've been talking about truly began. No dramatic lighting, no applause, no audience reaction, just a microphone, a script, a pair of headphones, and an actor standing alone, imagining an entire world. Voice acting, especially during the 90s animation boom, was deeply intimate work. These actors weren't reacting to finished animation. Most of the time, they were reacting to nothing. Blank space, storyboards, rough sketches, sometimes just written descriptions of a scene that didn't yet exist. And yet, they had to make it feel real. They had to believe in it first so the audience could believe later. Take Hey Arnold. Lane Torren has spoken about how understated those recording sessions were. Arnold wasn't performed loudly. He wasn't exaggerated. His voice wasn't put on. Lane stood at the mic and spoke calmly, thoughtfully, like someone who listens more than he talks. And that choice wasn't accidental. The creators wanted Arnold to feel grounded, a still point in a noisy world. Lane understood that immediately. He didn't rush lines. He didn't punch jokes. He let silences exist. In animation, silence is dangerous, feels risky, but silence can also be powerful. Arnold's pauses gave other characters room to be big. Helga's intensity, Gerald's confidence, Grandpa's bluster. Arnold didn't compete. He anchored, and that anchoring happened in a booth, line by line, take by take, with a director gently adjusting tone rather than volume. Sometimes the direction wasn't funnier or bigger. Sometimes it was simply, let's slow that down. Let's make that softer. Let's let that thought land. Those small adjustments shaped an entire show's emotional identity. Now contrast that with the Powerpuff Girls. Tom Kenny's sessions were often energetic, but still precise. Even when voicing chaos, Tom was controlled. When he improvised as the mayor, he wasn't just being silly. He was testing rhythms, finding musicality in panic, discovering patterns that could repeat without becoming stale. Improvisation in voice acting isn't random. It's exploratory. Tom would try variations. Faster, slower, more breathless, more restrained. Craig McCracken listened carefully, not for jokes, but for character truth. When something felt right, it stayed. Not because it was funny, but because it belonged. That's an important distinction. The booth wasn't a place to perform for people. It was a place to discover with collaborators. And sometimes the most important moments happened when actors recorded together. In group sessions, increasingly rare now, actors could react in real time. Overlaps happened. Laughter slipped in. A line delivery shifted because someone else surprised you. Tara Strong has talked about how those shared sessions helped her performances breathe. She could feel when to pull back, when to lean in, when to respond emotionally rather than technically. Those reactions didn't come from planning. They came from listening. Now think about Rugrats. Recording babies is strange work. You're an adult, standing alone in a booth, making sounds that are intentionally imperfect. Burps, half-words, excited noises that don't quite resolve into language. Kath Soucie treated that not as silliness, but as study. She listened to real children, paid attention to how toddlers start sentences they don't finish, how excitement interrupts speech, how emotions come out before words. In the booth, Kath didn't rush through lines. She let the messiness exist. That messiness is what made Phil and Lil feel real. And when she switched between them, sometimes within seconds, she didn't exaggerate the difference. She trusted subtlety, different posture, different breath, different intention. Those micro-choices mattered more than pitch. Christine Cavanaugh approached the booth differently. Christine prepared meticulously. For Dexter, she studied accents, listened to recordings, tested sounds until she found something that felt consistent and sustainable. Because consistency is its own kind of kindness to animators, to directors, to audiences. Once Christine found Dexter's voice, she protected it. Even when tired, even when emotional, even across long sessions. That discipline allowed Dexter to feel stable, a character you could return to and trust. Now imagine Batman, the animated series. Kevin Conroy stood alone in a booth, delivering lines that were often quiet, minimal, controlled. Batman didn't monologue. He observed. Kevin understood that restraint was the point. He didn't fill space unnecessarily. He trusted the silence between words, and that trust made Batman feel powerful. Mark Hamill, in contrast, used the booth like a playground. He moved. He leaned. He laughed mid-line. He experimented constantly. Sometimes he'd try something just to see how it felt. A higher laugh, a breathy pause, a sudden drop into menace. Not all of it made it into episodes, but all of it informed the final performance. The booth allowed that freedom, because no one was watching. That's something people often forget. Voice acting happens without eyes, without an audience, without feedback. It requires imagination, patience, and trust. You have to trust that your choices will make sense later, that animators will meet you halfway, that editors will preserve the intention, that audiences will feel what you felt. That trust is why these performances resonate decades later. They weren't rushed. They weren't cynical. They weren't manufactured. They were made by people standing quietly in small rooms, caring deeply about imaginary worlds. As we pause here, let that image settle. A single microphone, a script with scribbled notes, a voice actor closing their eyes, imagining a playground, a city, a laboratory, a Gotham skyline, speaking into emptiness and filling it with meaning. In the next part, we'll talk about something even quieter. Moments that almost didn't make it. Lines that were nearly cut. Performances that changed shows in ways no one predicted at the time. Small decisions. Last-minute choices. And how sometimes the most lasting impact comes from things no one thought would matter. There's a strange truth about the moments we remember most. They're often the ones that almost didn't happen. In animation, especially television animation, nothing is guaranteed. Lines are cut for time. Performances are adjusted for tone. Entire scenes disappear quietly, without ceremony. And yet, Some of the most iconic moments from the shows we've been talking about tonight exist only because someone hesitated and chose not to erase them, because someone listened closely, because someone trusted instinct over efficiency. These moments weren't planned to be memorable. They weren't designed to become iconic. They survived because they felt true. Let's return to Hey Arnold. Francesca Marie Smith's performance as Helga Pataki is now legendary. The rage, the sarcasm, the venom, but hidden inside all that sharpness was something softer, something fragile. Helga's poetry. Those moments were risky. A cartoon bully delivering raw, emotional monologues about unrequited love could have felt embarrassing. Overwritten. Too much. Many shows would have cut those scenes down, played them for irony, softened them with jokes. But Hey Arnold didn't. Francesca recorded those poetry scenes with absolute sincerity. No wink, no apology, no attempt to protect the audience from discomfort. Her voice dropped, slowed, trembled but never broke. She treated Helga's feelings as real. And in early recordings, there was hesitation. Would kids understand this? Would it slow the show down too much? Would it feel out of place? But when the creators listened back, something became clear. This wasn't just a gag. This was the heart of the character. So they left it. And in doing so, they gave animation one of its most complex emotional portraits, a child hiding vulnerability behind cruelty. Those scenes mattered because they weren't safe. Now think about Rugrats. Christine Cavanaugh's Chucky Finster was anxious in a way children recognized immediately. His fear wasn't exaggerated for humor, it was specific. He worried about germs, about safety, about loss. There were episodes where Chucky's fear lingered longer than network executives were comfortable with, where jokes were sparse, where silence carried emotional weight. In some early drafts, those scenes were shorter, but Christine's delivery changed things. When she spoke as Chucky, she didn't rush. She let the worry breathe. She allowed pauses where Chucky thought through his fear instead of immediately reacting. Those pauses made the fear feel real. Cutting them would have flattened the character. So they stayed. And Chucky became more than comic relief. He became representation for anxious kids. Kids who needed to see that fear didn't disqualify them from friendship or adventure. Then there's Dexter's Laboratory. Christine Cavanaugh again, but in a completely different emotional register. Dexter was loud, precise, controlled, but sometimes, in moments of frustration or defeat, Christine would let a tiny crack slip into his voice. Just a hint of exhaustion, a slight sag in posture that translated into sound. Those moments weren't scripted. They were human, and they could have been smoothed out, made cleaner, more consistent, but leaving them in made Dexter feel alive. A genius child who wasn't invincible. A prodigy who still felt overwhelmed. A boy playing adult games in a child's body. Those cracks mattered. Now return to the Powerpuff Girls. Tom Kenny's mayor was chaos incarnate. But within that chaos were oddly quiet moments. Moments of confusion, vulnerability, even sadness. Sometimes, between donut jokes and panicked phone calls, Tom would deliver a line softer than expected. Slower, almost reflective. Those moments weren't always planned. But Craig McCracken recognized something important. The mayor wasn't just funny. He was overwhelmed. And that humanity made him more than a punchline. So those quieter takes stayed. And they added dimension to what could have been a one-note character. Then there's Batman, the animated series. Kevin Conroy's restraint was risky. Network animation at the time favored loud heroes. Clear moralizing. Assertive delivery. Kevin went the opposite direction. He spoke softly, sometimes barely above a whisper. He let silence do the work. There were moments where producers worried Batman sounded too quiet, too restrained. But when paired with the animation, the stillness became power. Batman didn't need to raise his voice, because he didn't need to prove himself. And that choice defined the character for generations. Mark Hamill, on the other hand, pushed boundaries constantly. The Joker's laugh was never fixed. It changed episode to episode. Sometimes manic, sometimes controlled, sometimes playful, sometimes horrifying. In some recordings, Mark went further than expected. Higher pitches, longer laughs, sudden tonal drops. Those takes could have been trimmed, simplified, made safer. But the unpredictability was the point. The Joker shouldn't feel contained, so the edges stayed. Now think about Recess. The show thrived on small moments, half-finished thoughts, overlapping dialogue, awkward pauses. Those moments weren't flashy. They didn't announce themselves, but they made the playground feel real. When Spinelli hesitated before showing kindness, when Mikey spoke gently instead of loudly, when Gretchen paused mid-sentence to think. Those moments could have been sped up, but letting them linger made the world believable. Here's the quiet truth. Animation is fragile. Every moment you love survived multiple opportunities to be removed. It survived because someone believed it mattered, because someone chose honesty over speed, because someone trusted the audience to feel something instead of being told what to feel. And that trust is why these shows still resonate. They weren't afraid of stillness. They weren't afraid of sincerity. They weren't afraid of emotion that didn't immediately resolve. Those risks became rewards. So as you rest here, let that idea settle. That the things that stay with us often weren't guaranteed. That meaning is sometimes accidental. That art isn't always planned. It's protected. In the next part, we'll look at how these voices followed their audiences forward. How childhood performances echoed into adulthood. How nostalgia formed, not suddenly but slowly. And how these voices became markers of time itself. Something subtle happens as time passes. You don't notice it at first. You're still watching the shows, still hearing the voices, still laughing at the jokes and following the stories. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, those voices begin to attach themselves to moments beyond the screen. They start to live in memory, not as lines of dialogue but as feelings. The voice of Arnold becomes associated with calm, with fairness, with the idea that listening matters. Years later, you might not remember a specific episode, but you remember how Arnold made you feel. Steady, seen, reassured. That's not nostalgia yet. That's imprinting. Psychologists talk about how children attach emotional meaning to sound before image. A voice can signal safety before a face is recognized. Comfort before context is understood. These actors were speaking into that vulnerable space, whether they knew it or not. Christine Cavanaugh's Chucky wasn't just a cartoon character. For many children, he was the first time fear felt acknowledged rather than dismissed. Chucky was scared and still included. He cried and wasn't ridiculed. He hesitated and was still loved. That matters when you're small. It teaches you that fear doesn't disqualify you from belonging. And years later, when adults hear Christine's voice in interviews or reruns, there's often an unexpected emotional response. A tightness in the chest. A sense of recognition that goes beyond story. That's memory responding to sound. The same is true for Dexter. Christine's voice as Dexter carried tension. Not anger, but pressure. The pressure of trying to control a world that keeps slipping out of alignment. As children, we laughed at Dee Dee ruining experiments. As adults, some of us recognize something deeper. Dexter wasn't just frustrated, he was overwhelmed. And that realization often comes years later, when we hear that voice again and suddenly understand it differently. The voice didn't change. We did. Tom Kenny's Mayor is another example. As kids, he was funny, loud, ridiculous. As adults, he's still funny, but there's something else there too. A kind of exhaustion. A man in over his head, relying on others, desperately trying to appear competent. That shift in perception doesn't come from new information. It comes from lived experience. The voice stays the same, but meaning evolves. That's the quiet power of long-running animated voices. They don't age, but we do. Kevin Conroy's Batman followed many viewers across decades. When you're young, Batman is cool, strong, serious. When you're older, Batman is tired. He's disciplined, controlled, carrying weight. Kevin's voice always held that weight, even when we weren't ready to hear it. And then one day, suddenly, we are. Mark Hamill's Joker does something similar, but in reverse. As kids, the Joker is scary and funny. As adults, he becomes unsettling in a different way. Less cartoon villain, more embodiment of chaos, of unpredictability, of systems breaking down. The laugh doesn't change. Our understanding does. Then there's Recess. As children, it's a playground adventure. As adults, it's a social study. You start to notice how power operates. Who gets excluded? Who adapts? Who leads quietly? Who survives by observing? Spinelli's toughness feels less like aggression and more like armor. Mikey's kindness feels rarer. Gretchen's intelligence feels underappreciated. And TJ's leadership feels fragile. Andrew Lawrence voiced TJ without arrogance, without certainty, and that choice becomes more meaningful with time. TJ wasn't always right. He was just willing to try. That's not a lesson that hits immediately, settles later. Rugrats might be the most profound example of this phenomenon. As children, Rugrats is adventure and chaos. As adults, it becomes a meditation on vulnerability. You hear how small the babies are, how unsure, how often they misunderstand the world, and how much courage it takes just to exist in it. Kath Soucie's Phil and Lil aren't just mischievous. They're learning boundaries. E.G. Daly's Tommy isn't just brave. He's curious. He trusts the world before it gives him reason not to. And Cree Summers' Angelica, once purely antagonistic, becomes something else entirely when heard through adult ears. A child desperate for control because she lacks it elsewhere. The voice doesn't soften. Our empathy expands. This is how sound becomes time travel. These voices don't just remind us of shows. They remind us of who we were when we first heard them. The couch we sat on. The time of day. The feeling of coming home from school. Sound bypasses logic. It goes straight to memory. And these actors unknowingly became anchors. Their voices stayed steady while everything else changed. That's why hearing them now can feel grounding. Why reruns feel comforting rather than dated. Why people put these videos on in the background while working, or resting, or falling asleep. They're familiar without demanding attention. They're emotionally safe. And safety is something we seek more as we grow. So as you rest here, notice how these voices drift through your memory. Not as scenes, but as sensations. A tone, cadence, a pause. They don't ask anything from you. They're just there. In the next part, we'll look at what happened when this era ended. When recording styles changed. When group sessions disappeared. When animation became faster and sometimes louder. And what was quietly lost along the way. Nothing ends all at once. It fades. Quietly. So quietly that, at first, no one realizes anything has changed. The voices are still there. The shows are still being made. The animation still moves. But something feels different. Not wrong, just thinner. This shift didn't come from one decision or one network memo. It came from a series of small changes, each reasonable on its own, that slowly altered the way animated voices were created. Recording sessions began to shorten. Budgets tightened. Schedules compressed. Group sessions became rare, then almost non-existent. Actors started recording alone, separated by time instead of reacting together in the moment. And with that separation, something subtle began to disappear. Not talent, not professionalism, but presence. In the earlier era, actors listened to each other constantly. They adjusted tone mid-scene. They reacted emotionally instead of mechanically. A line delivery could change because someone else surprised you. That spontaneity was fragile. And fragility doesn't survive efficiency well. Modern animation often records actors separately, sometimes months apart. Performances are stitched together later. Clean, controlled, consistent. But consistency isn't the same as connection. Without real-time interaction, performances become more precise but less responsive. Less conversational. Less alive. That doesn't mean modern voice acting lacks quality. It means the texture changed. Earlier shows embraced imperfection. Overlaps stayed. Breaths were audible. Pauses lingered. Those imperfections weren't mistakes. They were evidence of humans sharing space. When actors like Pamela Adlon or Tara Strong recorded together, there was laughter between takes. Small adjustments that weren't scripted. A sense of play. Play is difficult to schedule, and play doesn't fit neatly into spreadsheets, so it slowly vanished. Another change came from tone. Animation grew louder, faster pacing, higher energy, more constant stimulation. This wasn't because actors forgot how to be subtle. It was because subtlety became risky. Silence can feel like dead air. Pauses can feel like weakness. Quiet moments can be mistaken for boredom. Networks grew cautious. But what earlier shows understood instinctively was that quiet moments create contrast. You need stillness to feel chaos. You need softness to feel impact. You need calm to feel tension. Kevin Conroy's Batman relied on that stillness. So did Arnold. So did Chucky. So did Gretchen. So did Mikey. Their power came from restraint. As animation shifted toward constant momentum, that restraint became harder to justify. Then there was casting. In the earlier era, voice actors weren't always chosen because they sounded marketable. They were chosen because they felt right, because their voice carried something specific, because they listened well. Later, celebrity casting became more common, sometimes effective, sometimes distracting. A recognizable voice pulls attention toward the actor, not the character. Earlier performances disappeared into roles. You didn't think about who was voicing Spinelli or Helga or Dexter. You just believed them. That invisibility was a strength. Another quiet loss came from trust. Earlier directors trusted actors deeply. They let improvisation happen. They let lines run long. They let emotional beats land without explanation. Tom Kenny wasn't micromanaged. Francesca Marie Smith wasn't told to soften Helga's poetry. Christine Cavanaugh wasn't rushed through Chucky's fear. That trust took time, and time became scarce. But here's the important thing. None of this erased the work that came before. Those earlier performances still exist. They still hold space. They still offer something different from the noise of modern media. That's why long-form videos like the one you're creating resonate. They slow things down. They invite reflection. They let people sit with memory instead of scrolling past it. They recreate, in a small way, the pacing that once defined this era of animation. So when someone puts on a 90-minute voice actor documentary and lets it play while resting, they're not just learning facts. They're returning to a rhythm where voices weren't rushing to fill every second, where pauses were allowed, where characters breathed. This isn't about nostalgia as escape. It's about nostalgia as grounding. about remembering that not everything needs to shout to matter. As we prepare to move into the final stretch of this journey, keep that idea close. That something valuable lived in those quiet spaces. And that by revisiting them slowly, deliberately, we're not going backward. We're reconnecting. In the next part, we'll bring everything together. Not with a conclusion that rushes to summarize, but with a final settling. A gentle closing of the circle. At some point, without realizing it, you stop actively listening. The words keep coming. The voices continue. But they drift into something softer. Something closer to feeling than information. And that's where we are now. Not at an ending, but at a resting place. Because the stories we've been sharing were never meant to be consumed quickly. They weren't designed to impress. They weren't structured to demand attention every second. They were meant to exist alongside you. The way these voices always have. Think back to the beginning. To Arnold, standing quietly in the center of a noisy city. Not fixing everything. Not shouting. Just listening. Just caring. That voice taught patience without ever saying the word. Helga, writing poetry in secret, her voice trembling with feelings she didn't know how to express openly. Teaching that vulnerability doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind anger. Dexter, trying desperately to control a world that refused to cooperate. His voice tight with effort, reminding us how exhausting it is to carry expectations too early. Dee Dee, moving through chaos with joy, her voice filled with motion and curiosity, showing that not every disruption is malicious. Sometimes it's simply alive. Tommy, stepping forward into the unknown, not because he was fearless, but because curiosity outweighed hesitation. Chucky, afraid and moving anyway. Bubbles, soft but not weak. Spinelli, tough but not closed. Batman, restrained, carrying weight quietly. The Joker, laughing not because he was free, but because he wasn't. These weren't just characters. They were emotional templates. They showed us different ways of being in the world. Different ways of responding to fear, authority, friendship, failure, and love. And the actors behind them didn't approach this work casually. They brought intention. They brought restraint. They brought a respect for the audience, especially young audiences. That's rare. They trusted that kids could handle complexity. That kids could sit with sadness. That kids could understand subtlety. And maybe most importantly, they trusted that kids deserved honesty. These performances didn't rush to explain themselves. They didn't tell you how to feel. They simply existed and let you meet them where you were. That's why, years later, these voices still feel safe. Why people put them on while working late, or while cleaning, or while trying to sleep. They don't demand reaction. They offer presence. There's something deeply comforting about that. About knowing that something from your past was made carefully. That it wasn't cynical. That it wasn't disposable. That someone stood in a quiet booth, spoke into a microphone, and genuinely cared whether a line felt right. Not perfect, just true. That care lingers. It lives in the pacing, in the pauses, in the way certain lines land softly instead of sharply. And that's what this entire journey has been about. Not trivia, not behind-the-scenes facts, but appreciation. A slow acknowledgement of invisible work. Of people whose names you may not have known, but whose voices helped shape who you became. And maybe that's why this kind of content works. Why cozy cartoon lore resonates. Because it doesn't fight the world's noise. It offers an alternative rhythm. A reminder that creativity can be gentle. That impact doesn't require volume. That something can be meaningful without demanding urgency. So now, as this story settles, there's nothing left to explain. No lesson to underline. No final fact to reveal. Just space. Space for these voices to fade naturally. the way they always did when the TV clicked off and the room grew quiet. Space for memory to do what it does best. Carry feeling forward. If you're listening to this while resting, let it soften further. If you're listening while awake, let it stay with you quietly. And if one day, long from now, you hear one of these voices again, unexpectedly, maybe you'll pause. Maybe you'll smile. Maybe you'll feel something familiar, warm, and hard to name. That's the work. That's the craft. That's the gift these actors gave not just to animation, but to time itself. And it's still here, waiting, just like it always has. You're safe to rest now. The voices have done their work, and they'll be here whenever you're ready to listen again.